Stop looking for the money. It's God's duty now. 2 hours of Neville Goddard. Hook. Two jobs are described in this video. One of them belongs to you and takes about 10 quiet minutes a night. The other one was never yours, and the whole of Neville Goddard's teaching, developed across 12 books and more than 2 decades of recorded lectures between 1948 and 1971, turns on the moment a person finally stops trying to do it. The impossible-sounding promise is this: you can stop looking for the money, not stop working, not stop living, not stop paying attention to your own life, but stop scanning, stop calculating the route, stop checking the balance to see whether the thing has arrived yet. Goddard taught that the route is not your department, and never was, and that the constant search for it is the most reliable way a person has ever found to keep the thing they are searching for out of reach. That claim sounds like a permission slip for laziness. It is not one. What follows takes the promise apart slowly, names what Goddard actually meant by the word God when he assigned that second job elsewhere, and marks the exact places where the sentence in the title is a fair summary of his position, and the places where it is a modern simplification he never once wrote down. Section headings begin. What this video is actually going to test. Start with the sentence itself, because it deserves to be handled honestly before anything is built on top of it. Stop looking for the money. It is God's duty now. That sentence does not appear in Neville Goddard's 12 books. It does not appear in the recorded lecture material that survives from his active years. It is not a quotation, and any video that presents it as one is presenting something that cannot be sourced. This channel would rather say that plainly in the first 2 minutes than let a comfortable phrase carry authority it has not earned. What is true is that the sentence is a modern compression of a position Goddard genuinely held and returned to for more than 30 years, and that the compression is not a distortion so much as a shortcut. He taught that a person has exactly one creative task, that the task is to occupy the finished state of a wish rather than to pursue it, and that everything downstream of that task, every route, every arrangement, every unexpected phone call and coincidence and change of circumstance belongs to a power he was willing to call God, and which he defined in a very specific and frequently misunderstood way. So the video has 2 obligations, and it will meet both. The first is to state what Goddard actually taught about the surrender of the means, using his own vocabulary, his own books, and the terms he actually used, rather than the ones the internet has since attached to his name. The second is to be specific about where the modern packaging goes further than he did, because there is a version of this teaching circulating now that quietly turns it into a devotional instruction to sit still and wait for a heavenly deposit, and that version is not his. Consider what would follow if the promise were simply true as stated. A person who genuinely believed that the arrangement of the means was not their responsibility would stop doing several things immediately. They would stop mentally rehearsing the ways money might arrive. They would stop auditing their circumstances for evidence. They would stop the small, constant, exhausting inner accounting that most people conduct all day without ever calling it anything. Whether that stopping is a good idea, whether it is safe, whether Goddard actually asked for it, and what he thought a person should be doing instead, is the whole subject of the next 90 minutes. The video is built to be listened to slowly, in order, or at night with the lights off. Each section stands on its own and carries one idea to its end before the next one begins. Nothing in it will ask you to accept a story that cannot be sourced, and where the record is thin, the video will say so out loud rather than filling the gap with something that sounds better. The man who made the claim in the first place. Neville Lancelot Goddard was born on the 19th of February, 1905, in St. Michael, Barbados, one of 9 children in a merchant family. That detail about the family matters more than it usually gets credit for, because a merchant household is a household in which money is discussed openly, arrives unevenly, and is understood as something that moves rather than something that sits. He was 17 when he left for New York City in 1922, and he did not go there to teach anything. He went to work, and the work he found was on the stage. He was a dancer. That is an unusual apprenticeship for a metaphysical teacher, and it left marks on the teaching. A dancer learns a physical discipline in which the felt interior sense of a movement and the visible outer shape of it are the same event, not 2 events. He spent years learning to produce an outer fact by first assuming an inner posture, which is a fair description of the technique he would spend the rest of his life explaining in other words. In New York, sometime across the 1920s and 30s, he met the teacher he only ever named as Abdullah, a black mystic often described in later accounts as an Ethiopian rabbi, though the actual origins are debated, and this video will not pretend otherwise. Abdullah taught him Hebrew, scripture, and the interpretive method that underlies everything Goddard later published. He married Mildred Mary Hughes in 1923, and they separated. His son Joseph was born in 1924. He married Catherine Van Schumas in 1938, and their daughter Victoria followed. 1938 is also roughly when he began speaking publicly. The first book came in 1939. Audio recordings of his lectures begin around 1948, and from there until about 1971, he lectured steadily, mostly in New York City and Los Angeles, with documented appearances in San Francisco and San Diego, and occasional returns to Barbados. He died on the 1st of October 1972 in Los Angeles. Those dates matter for a practical reason. Anyone quoting a Goddard lecture from before 1948 or after 1971 is quoting something that does not exist in the recorded record, and a great deal of material circulating under his name now falls outside those years. This video stays inside them. What is worth holding on to from the biography is the shape of the man rather than the trivia. He was not a wealthy heir teaching detachment from a comfortable distance, and he was not a preacher with an institution behind him. He was a working performer who found a method, tested it on his own circumstances for a decade before he taught it to anyone, and then spent 30 years saying more or less the same thing in 100 different ways to audiences who kept coming back. The consistency is the striking thing. The man who was teaching in 1968 was teaching what the man in 1939 had already written down. What Goddard meant when he said the word God. This is the section that decides whether the rest of the video is honest, so it comes early rather than late. When Goddard used the word God, he was not referring to a separate being located elsewhere who reviews requests and disperses funds to the deserving. That is the reading most people bring to the sentence in this video's title, and it is not his. In the lectures of his later years, recorded through the 1960s and into 1971, he stated his position about as bluntly as it can be stated. God, he taught, is your own wonderful human imagination. The creative power of the universe, in his account, is not adjacent to a person. It is the very faculty they are using when they close their eyes and picture something that is not there. This is why his central term is I am, not as a slogan and not as an affirmation to be repeated, but as a description of the only thing a person can never step outside of, which is their own awareness of being. Goddard held that this awareness is the creative principle itself, that it is what Scripture is actually describing, and that a person's various circumstances are the visible record of what that awareness has been quietly assuming about itself. Now the consequence, and it is a sharp one. If God is your own imagination, then the sentence "stop looking for the money, it is God's duty now," does not mean hand the problem to somebody else and go to sleep. It means something considerably more demanding. It means the responsibility moves from your hands to your imagination, from the department of doing to the department of being, and both of those departments are you. Nothing has been outsourced. What has changed is which of your own faculties is doing the work. This distinction is worth guarding because the drift is easy and it goes in a predictable direction. Goddard used biblical language constantly. He read scripture as psychological drama rather than as history. He used phrases like "Christ in you," "the hope of glory," and his later teaching, which he called the promise, is entirely built out of Christian mystical vocabulary. It is therefore very easy to hear him for 10 minutes and conclude he was teaching ordinary devotion. He was not, and he said so repeatedly. He endorsed no denomination. He asked no one to petition an external authority. He treated the whole biblical apparatus as a description of what happens inside a human being. So when this video says, "The duty is not yours," understand it precisely. The duty of arranging the means is not the job of your conscious, planning, calculating attention. It is the job of the deeper creative faculty Goddard called God, and located inside the person using it. That faculty does not need your instructions about how. It needs one thing from you, which the next several sections describe in detail, and it needs you to stop interfering with everything else. At Your Command and The Book Before the Others, Goddard published 12 books between 1939 and 1966, and the first of them, At Your Command, is by some distance the least discussed. It is short, it is blunt, and it contains the entire teaching in compressed form before he had developed the softer explanatory style of the later work. Anyone who wants the position stated without decoration should start there, and this video leans on it more heavily than most treatments do. The title is The Argument, At Your Command. Not at your request, not at your petition, not at your hopeful suggestion. The book's claim is that a person is not applying to a power for a favor, but exercising a power they already hold, and that the reason it does not appear to work is that they are using it constantly in the wrong direction without noticing. The book's operative instruction can be paraphrased in one line, and the paraphrase is faithful. Things have no reality except in consciousness, so obtain the consciousness of the thing, and the thing itself is compelled to appear. That sentence, written in 1939, is the seed of everything he taught for the next 3 decades, and it is also the sentence that makes this video's title intelligible. If the thing is compelled to appear, once the consciousness is obtained, then hunting the thing is not merely unnecessary, it is a category error. You would be searching the outer world for something that is produced by an inner condition you have not yet met. Notice the word compelled. Goddard chose forceful mechanical language, not gentle spiritual language, and he chose it in his very first book. He is not describing a universe that responds kindly to nice people. He is describing a law that operates the way any law operates, indifferently and without exception, on whoever satisfies its condition. That is why the teaching cannot be reduced to positive thinking. Positive thinking is a mood. What At Your Command describes is a condition, and a condition either obtains or it does not. The book also carries the seed of the surrender that the title of this video points at. If the appearance of the thing is compelled by the consciousness, then the timing, the root, and the mechanism are all effects of the same cause, and none of them require separate management. You do not obtain the consciousness and then additionally arrange the delivery. The delivery is what the consciousness does. There is one more reason this book deserves the attention. It was written before Goddard had an audience, before the lectures, before the fame, and before any commercial pressure existed to make the teaching palatable. Whatever else it is not a marketed version of his ideas. It is the version he wrote when he was still mostly convincing himself, and the certainty in it is the certainty of somebody reporting a mechanism rather than selling a hope. Consciousness is the only reality. This is the metaphysical floor under everything else in the video, and it is one of the few phrases in this script that Goddard used as a settled statement rather than a passing image. Consciousness is the only reality. Everything else in his account is effect. Taken seriously, this reorganizes what a bank balance is. In the ordinary view, a balance is a fact, and a person's inner state is a reaction to that fact. Cause runs from the number to the feeling. Goddard reverses the arrow entirely. In his account, the number is the outer report of an inner state that was occupied earlier and has since had time to become visible. Cause runs from the state to the number. The number is the news, not the event. If that is right, then a person examining their balance for information about their prospects is doing something structurally odd. They are reading yesterday's report and treating it as tomorrow's forecast. Worse, the act of reading it anxiously is itself the occupation of a state, and that state is the state of a person who does not yet have what they want. So the check is not a neutral observation. It is a creative act pointed in the wrong direction, performed several times a day by somebody who believes they are simply gathering information. This is the mechanism that makes the title's instruction more than a comfort. Stop looking for the money is not advice about attitude. In Goddard's system, it is a technical instruction about which state you are occupying while you look. Looking, in the anxious sense, requires the assumption of absence. It cannot be done from any other state. A person who genuinely occupied the state of having would not check in the same way that a person who is not thirsty does not think about water. None of this requires believing that the outer world is a hallucination. Goddard was not asking anyone to deny that bills exist or that numbers are real. His claim was narrower and stranger than that. He held that the outer world is real and also entirely derivative, that it faithfully reports a condition rather than generating one, and that the leverage therefore sits at the level of the condition and nowhere else. The practical consequence is the thing to carry forward. If consciousness is the only reality, then there is exactly one place where anything can be changed, and it is not in the arrangement of circumstances. Every hour spent rearranging circumstances while the underlying state is untouched is an hour spent editing a report and expecting the event to change. Goddard's whole method is the refusal to do that, and the redirection of all that effort to the single place where he believed it does something. The two jobs and which one was never yours. Here is the division the hook promised, stated cleanly. The first job is to establish and hold a single inner state, which Goddard called the wish fulfilled. Not the wish fulfilled. The difference is the whole method. To want money is to occupy the state of a person who lacks it. To hold the wish fulfilled is to occupy, deliberately and with feeling, the state of a person for whom the matter is already settled. That is the first job. It belongs entirely to you, and nobody else can do it on your behalf. The second job is everything else. It is the identification of the source, the sequence of events that produces it, the timing, the person who makes the call, the opportunity that had not been invented yet last week, the chain of small, unremarkable incidents that connects the state you occupied on a Tuesday night to a fact that exists on some later Thursday. Goddard's position, consistent across every book and every recorded year, is that this second job is not yours, was never yours, and cannot be done by you even when you try, because the conscious planning mind does not have access to the material it would need. That last point is worth slowing down on, because it is the argument rather than the assertion. Consider any specific outcome a person has ever wanted. The route by which it eventually arrived almost always involved at least one element the person did not know existed at the time of wanting. A stranger they had not met, a business that had not yet opened, a decision made by somebody else for reasons of their own. If that is generally true, then a person planning a route is planning it out of an inventory that is missing most of its contents. They are not being resourceful. They are drawing a map of a country using only the streets they have personally walked down. Goddard's claim is that the deeper faculty is not restricted in that way, and that it produces routes out of material the planning mind has no access to. This is why he was so insistent that a person should never specify the how, not because specifying is impious, but because specifying is limiting. Every route a person insists on is a route drawn from the small inventory, and insisting on it excludes every route drawn from the large one. So the instruction, "Stop looking for the money," is not a spiritual flourish. It is the practical consequence of a division of labor. You do the one thing you can do, which is to establish the state. You decline the one thing you cannot do, which is to design the mechanism. And you decline it not once, in a moment of grand surrender, but repeatedly, in 100 small moments across a week, when the planning mind offers to help and has to be told, gently and without drama, that this part is handled. The reason most people never experience the teaching working is not that they fail at the first job. It is that they do the first job for 11 minutes and the second job for the remaining 15 hours. Acceptance of the end wills the means. Goddard gave the division of labor a name, and the sentence is one of the most precise things he ever wrote. In Feeling is the Secret, published in 1944, he said it inside a longer passage which runs, in substance, like this. Everything you could need or desire is already yours. You require no helper to give it to you. Call your desires into being by imagining and feeling the wish fulfilled. And then the line itself. As the end is accepted, you become totally indifferent as to possible failure, for acceptance of the end wills the means to that end. Read that last clause slowly, because it contains a claim that is easy to skim past. It does not say that acceptance of the end makes the means more likely. It does not say acceptance improves your chances of finding the means. It says acceptance wills them. The acceptance is the act that produces the route. The route is not a separate thing that must additionally be arranged after the acceptance is achieved. If that is taken literally, and Goddard meant it literally, then the whole architecture of ordinary striving collapses into a single point. There is no sequence in which a person first believes and then works out how. There is only the acceptance, from which the how emerges as a consequence. Notice also the phrase, totally indifferent as to possible failure. That is a strong claim about the emotional signature of a genuine acceptance, and it doubles as a diagnostic. Goddard is saying that a person who has actually accepted an end does not feel anxious about whether it will occur, in the ordinary and unremarkable way that a person is not anxious about whether tomorrow morning will arrive. If anxiety is present, the acceptance has not been made. That is not a moral failing, and he did not treat it as one. It is simply information about the current state, which is the only thing his method ever asks a person to gather. This is the sentence that the title of this video is compressing. Stop looking for the money. It is God's duty now, is a modern paraphrase of acceptance of the end, wills the means to that end, with the word God standing in for the creative faculty Goddard, located in the human imagination. The paraphrase is looser and warmer than his original, and it loses the precision of the word wills, which carries the whole mechanism. But it is not a misrepresentation, and this video will use his sentence rather than the paraphrase from here on, because his is the one that can be checked. The practical instruction that falls out of it is unglamorous. Establish the end. Notice whether indifference to failure has arrived. If it has not, the work is not finished, and no amount of activity in the outer world will finish it. Why the means are not yours to design. There is a specific failure mode that Goddard described repeatedly, and almost everybody who has tried this teaching has run into it without recognizing what happened. It is the substitution of the means for the end. A person decides they want their financial situation resolved. So far, so good. Then, in the act of imagining, they do not imagine the resolution. They imagine the raise, or the client, or the sale of the house, or the arrival of the settlement, or the particular conversation with the particular person that they have privately decided is the only realistic route. They believe they are imagining the end. They are imagining a means, and they have chosen it out of the small inventory described earlier. The consequence is not that nothing happens. The consequence, in Goddard's account, is worse than that. The imagination now has a specific and unnecessarily narrow instruction, and the person has attached their sense of whether the method is working to an event that may not be the route at all. When the raise does not come, they conclude the teaching failed, when what actually happened is that they submitted a route rather than a destination, and then judged the outcome by whether their route was accepted. His correction was consistent. Imagine the end, and imagine it in the smallest and most ordinary terms available. Not the check, the relief of not thinking about it anymore, not the transfer notification, the ordinary Tuesday of a person, for whom this is simply not a live concern. He asked people to find the scene that would only be taking place if the thing were already true, and to make that scene as unremarkable as possible, precisely because an unremarkable scene contains no root. There is a second reason for this discipline, and it is psychological rather than metaphysical. A specified route is checkable. If a person has decided the money arrives through a particular channel, they will watch that channel. And watching is the exact activity this video is about stopping. An unspecified end has nothing to watch. There is no inbox to refresh, no date to count down to, no person whose silence can be interpreted. The vagueness of the route is what makes rest possible. Goddard put this in a form worth remembering. The end is yours to choose. The means are not yours to choose. And the attempt to choose them is the interference that keeps the end at a distance. A person who wants to know how it will happen is, by the fact of wanting to know, standing outside the state in which it has already happened. Inside that state, the question does not arise, because people do not investigate the delivery route of something already in their possession. The bridge of incidents walked slowly. Goddard did have a description of how the means show up, and it is one of his most useful terms precisely because it is so undramatic. He called it the bridge of incidents. The image is exact. Between the state a person occupies tonight and the visible fact they eventually inhabit, there is a series of ordinary events, none of which look like a miracle, each of which is a plank. A conversation that changes direction unexpectedly. A plan that fails and thereby frees up a week. A message from somebody who has not been in touch for 2 years. An impulse to take a different route home. Individually, every one of these is unremarkable enough to be missed entirely. Assembled, they form a bridge that could not have been designed in advance by the person walking it. He described this most fully in Seed Time and Harvest, published in 1956, and returned to it in The Law and the Promise in 1961. The reason it matters for this video is that it answers the strongest objection to the surrender of the means, which is the objection that surrender sounds like nothing happening. In Goddard's account, a great deal happens. It simply does not happen in the register a person is monitoring. This creates a specific and rather cruel problem, and it is worth naming rather than glossing. The bridge is usually only visible from the far end. While a person is crossing it, the planks look like ordinary weeks. It is only afterwards, looking back, that the sequence resolves into something that appears to have been designed. This is why the teaching demands the indifference described in the previous section. A person who is grading each week on whether it looks like progress will conclude, correctly and uselessly, that most weeks do not. There is also a warning inside the image. A bridge can be dismantled. In Goddard's terms, the planks are laid by the assumption being held, and an assumption that is abandoned halfway through stops laying them. He was blunt about the fact that most people abandon the assumption at exactly the moment the bridge starts to look most like nothing, which is usually early, and then attribute the absence of a result to the method rather than to the abandonment. The instruction that follows is simple to state and difficult to do. Walk the planks that appear. Do not stand at the near end demanding to see the far one. When something ordinary happens that seems to move in the right direction, act on it without inspecting it for significance. And when nothing happens, do not treat the nothing as a verdict. The bridge is built out of the very material a person dismisses as too ordinary to count. The law he taught and the law he did not. A correction is owed here, because it bears directly on the title of this video and because it is the single most common error made about Goddard anywhere online. Goddard did not teach the law of attraction. He did not use the phrase. It is not in his books, and it is not the name of his mechanism, and the enormous body of modern material that files him under that heading is filing him wrongly. What he taught was the law of assumption, and the difference is not cosmetic. The law of attraction, as popularly described, holds that like attracts like, that a person's inner state emits something, and that the outer world responds by delivering matching circumstances from elsewhere. It is a magnetic model. There is a self, there is a universe, and things travel between them. The law of assumption makes no such claim. In Goddard's account, nothing travels because there is no elsewhere. A person assumes a state, meaning they occupy it as their own present identity, and the outer world subsequently reports that state because the outer world is derivative of consciousness rather than separate from it. Nothing is being attracted. Something is being expressed. This matters enormously for the subject at hand. Under a magnetic model, the sentence "stop looking for the money" would be nonsense, because under a magnetic model, you would want to remain alert for the arriving object, watching for the delivery. Under the law of assumption, watching is incoherent, because the thing is not traveling toward you from a distance. It is being produced by the state you are in, and monitoring for arrival is simply the occupation of a state in which it has not arrived. Goddard also rejected several other things now routinely attributed to him, and they are worth listing while the correction is open. He did not teach that a person should pretend, and the popular idea of behaving as if while privately disbelieving is the opposite of what he described. An assumption in his sense is genuine. or it is not an assumption at all. He did not teach effortful striving as the engine, and he did not frame the teaching in terms of energy or frequency, which is modern vocabulary that postdates him. He never appealed to physics. He was ambivalent about affirmation by repetition, holding that the felt state, not the repeated sentence, is what does the work. The reason to be strict about this is not pedantry. Every one of these substitutions changes the instruction a person actually follows. A person operating a magnetic model watches for delivery, and watching is the failure. A person operating a pretending model performs confidence while holding doubt, and the doubt is the actual state. A person operating a repetition model recites while feeling nothing, and the feeling was the mechanism. The vocabulary is the method, which is why this video keeps returning to his words rather than the ones that replaced them. What looking for it actually does. The title of this video gives an instruction, and it is time to examine the instruction mechanically rather than emotionally. What, in Goddard's system, actually happens when a person looks for the money? Start with what looking consists of. It is rarely a single deliberate act. It is a habit made of small, repeated movements. Opening the banking application at a red light, running the month's arithmetic in the shower for the 4th time, scanning an inbox for a particular sender, mentally rehearsing a conversation about a payment, calculating, at 2 in the morning, how many weeks the current situation can be sustained. None of these feel like metaphysics. They feel like being responsible. In Goddard's account, each one of them is an act of assumption, because assumption is not a formal ceremony performed with the eyes closed. It is whatever state a person is actually occupying, and the state a person occupies while auditing a shortfall is the state of a person experiencing a shortfall. The audit does not describe the condition. The audit is the condition, performed again. This produces the loop that makes the teaching feel like it does not work. A person spends 10 minutes at night deliberately occupying the state of the wish fulfilled, and then spends the next day performing 40 small acts of verification, each of which is an unintentional occupation of the opposite state. The 10 minutes are conscious, and the 40 acts are not, so the person believes they have been holding the assumption all day. They have not. They have been holding it for 10 minutes and dismantling it for the rest. Goddard was direct about the mechanism behind this. He held that an assumption produces its outer fact only when it is persisted in, and persistence is not a matter of intensity, but of duration and consistency. A brief, powerful assumption interrupted by constant contradiction is, in his terms, not persisted in at all. This is why he spoke so often about discipline of attention and so rarely about the strength of a visualization. There is a second and subtler cost to looking, and it is the one that catches careful people. Looking is a request for evidence, and a request for evidence is an admission that the matter is unsettled. A person who asks whether it is working has, in the act of asking, answered the question, because a settled thing does not generate that question. This is what the phrase, totally indifferent as to possible failure, was pointing at. The indifference is not a performance of calm. It is the natural absence of a question that no longer has any reason to be asked. So the instruction in the title, taken as Goddard would have taken it, is not a demand to stop being financially competent. Pay what needs paying, do the work in front of you, answer the letters. What is being asked to stop is the inner audit that runs alongside all of that, the constant low-grade checking that treats the outer world as the authority on a matter Goddard held is decided somewhere else entirely. The competent actions can continue. It is the surveillance that has to end. The woman and the coat she never went to find. There is a story Goddard told in his lectures for years, and it is worth revisiting for a reason it is almost never used for. A woman wanted a fur coat. That is the whole of the desire, and it is a small and unfashionable want by modern standards, which is part of why the story is useful. Goddard's instruction to her was not to plan an acquisition, it was to feel the coat. Specifically, to feel it as already hers, the weight of it across the shoulders, the texture of the fur under her own hand, the entirely unremarkable sensation of wearing a garment she owned. She did this, and the coat came to her. The story is usually told as an illustration of sensory vividness, which is fair enough, and this channel has told it that way before, but there is a detail in it that carries far more weight for the subject of this video, and it sits in what Goddard did not instruct her to do. He did not send her to look at coats. He did not tell her to identify the shop, or price the item, or open an account, or arrange the funds, or construct a plan by which a person in her circumstances could plausibly come to own such a thing. The instruction contained no root whatsoever. It concerned only the interior sensation of already having, and the arrival of the object was left entirely unspecified. That is the point worth extracting. Every element that a sensible person would consider the practical part of acquiring a coat was simply absent from the assignment. And the story, as Goddard told it, does not report her succeeding at the practical part. It reports the coat arriving by a route that was not hers to design after she had done the one thing that was. Two honest notes about this story, because the discipline of this channel requires them. The first is that it is documented across his lectures, rather than in a single, dated, verifiable account, and the fine detail varies in the retelling. It should be understood as a teaching case he used repeatedly, not as a case file with independent corroboration. The second is that a coat is a modest object and a person's entire financial position is not, and nothing about the story establishes that the same instruction scales to a mortgage. Goddard believed it did. The story does not prove it. What the story does establish, and what it is being used for here, is the shape of the instruction. Feel the having. Do not arrange the getting. Whatever else is uncertain about the fur coat, the structure of the assignment is completely clear, and that structure is the same structure this video's title is describing in more theological language. The wholesale operator and the limits of the record. Here is an account that this video is going to handle unusually, because handling it honestly is more useful than telling it well. Among the cases Goddard set down in Out of This World, published in 1949, is one usually referred to as the wholesale operator. It is a real entry in the documented record. It is one of the small number of specific cases that can be attributed to him with confidence, rather than to the enormous secondary literature that has grown up around his name. And that is very nearly all that can be said about it with certainty. The detail that circulates about this story online is considerably richer than what the reliable record supports. Figures are quoted, timelines are supplied, business specifics appear that cannot be traced back to a source that would survive being checked. This channel has looked for that detail and has not found it in a form that meets the standard applied to everything else in this video, and so it will not be supplied here. This is worth pausing on, because it is a live problem for anyone studying Goddard rather than merely consuming him. His public record contains a genuinely small number of documented anecdotes. It contains a very large number of stories told in his name. The gap between those two quantities has been filled, over 50 years, by retelling, by embellishment, by well-meaning summarizers rounding a vague memory into a specific claim, and by the ordinary drift that happens to any oral material passed through enough hands. The temptation, when building a video like this one, is to reach into that secondary material for a story with better numbers in it. The reason not to is not squeamishness. It is that the teaching's credibility rests entirely on the claim that it describes something real, and a teaching defended with invented evidence has quietly conceded the argument. So the wholesale operator stands here as an entry in the record and as a demonstration of a principle rather than as a narrative. The principle is this: a person is entitled to know which parts of what they are being told are documented and which parts are decoration, and a teacher who blurs that line is asking for a kind of trust they have not earned. Goddard himself, whatever else may be said about him, put his own cases in his own books under his own name, and those are the ones this channel will use. The practical value of this section is not the story. It is the standard. When you encounter this teaching elsewhere, and you will, ask where the specific detail comes from. The teaching survives the question. Most of the material built on top of it does not. Fourth dimensional thinking in plain words. Goddard used a term that sounds far more technical than the idea it names, and unpacking it is directly relevant to the surrender of the means. He called it fourth dimensional thinking. He was not making a claim about physics, and he never appealed to physics, which is a distinction the previous correction section already established. The term is his own way of describing a shift in where a person stands in time while they imagine. Ordinary thinking about a wish takes place from the present, looking forward. A person stands in today, examines the distance to what they want, and considers the route. Everything about that posture is forward-facing, and everything in it treats the wish as absent, because from today, the wish is in fact absent. Fourth dimensional thinking reverses the position. A person stands in the fulfilled state, looking back, and considers today from there. The practical difference is enormous and can be tested in about a minute. Think about a resolved financial situation from where you currently sit and notice what the mind does. It immediately produces the distance, the obstacles, the arithmetic. Now occupy the position of a person for whom the matter was resolved some time ago, and think back to the present period, and notice that the same facts, unchanged, are now describing something that was survived rather than something that is happening. Nothing about the outer circumstances moved. The vantage point moved, and the emotional signature of the identical facts changed completely. Goddard's claim is that this vantage point is not a mood but a creative position, and that a person occupying it is exercising the faculty he called God rather than merely comforting themselves. He developed this most fully in Awakened Imagination, published in 1954, though the idea runs through the earlier books as well. The reason it belongs in this video is that fourth dimensional thinking makes the surrender of the means structurally automatic, rather than an act of willpower. A person standing in the present cannot help but wonder how, because from the present, the how is the missing piece. A person standing in the fulfilled state does not wonder how, because from that position, the how already happened, and has the ordinary uninteresting quality of anything already accomplished. Nobody stands in a completed year and anxiously investigates the route by which it completed. That is the whole trick, and it is why Goddard's instruction was always to think from the wish rather than of it. Thinking of a wish keeps a person in the position where the means are a live problem. Thinking from it moves them to the only position in which the instruction in this video's title is not a strain, but a description of where they already are. The mental diet and the money sentence. Goddard had a name for the discipline that carries the assumption through a whole day rather than 10 minutes of it. He called it the mental diet, and he set it out most fully in Seed Time and Harvest, published in 1956. The image is deliberate. A person controls, with some care, what enters the body, and would not consider it eccentric to refuse certain things on the grounds that they produce a predictable effect. Goddard argued that the same attention applies to what a person allows themselves to think, and that the general failure to apply it is not a moral weakness, but simply an oversight about what thinking is for. His standard was strict. He asked people to refuse any thought that did not accord with the state they had chosen to occupy, not to argue with such thoughts, not to analyze where they came from, simply to decline them, in the way a person declines a dish, without ceremony and without treating the refusal as a struggle. Applied to money, this becomes a discipline about one particular category of sentence. There is a class of statement that runs through almost everyone's day without being noticed as a statement at all. It cannot be afforded. It will be tight until the end of the month. That will have to wait. There is no way that happens this year. These are not idle observations in Goddard's system. They are assumptions delivered with the full authority of the first person, and they are being made hundreds of times a week by people who would say, if asked, that they are simply describing reality. The mental diet says the description is the reality, or more precisely, that the description is the seed of the next reality, which is the point of naming the book Seed Time and Harvest in the first place. Sowing is not a special activity that takes place at prayer time. Sowing is every sentence. The practical form of this discipline is smaller than it sounds, and this video will not overstate it. It is not a demand for relentless positivity, which Goddard would have regarded as a different error rather than an improvement. It is a demand for accuracy about what a sentence is doing. A person can decline to state a limit without asserting the opposite. Instead of announcing that something cannot be afforded, the matter can simply be left unsaid, or set down as a decision rather than a verdict. Not this one, rather than never this one. The connection to the surrender of the means is direct. A day full of small limiting sentences is a day spent submitting routes and obstacles to the very faculty that was supposed to be left alone to work. The mental diet is what keeps the assignment clean between the deliberate sessions, and Goddard treated it as the more important of the two disciplines precisely because it occupies the hours rather than the minutes. Inner conversations. Overheard late at night. Alongside the mental diet, Goddard named a second discipline that is more specific and, for most people, more uncomfortable to look at honestly. He called it inner conversation. His observation was that a person is almost never silent inside. Through most of a waking day, there is a running dialogue, usually with somebody who is not present. An argument with a person who said something last Thursday, an explanation offered to a relative who has not asked for one, a defense prepared for a conversation that has not happened and may never happen, a justification, rehearsed in advance, of a decision nobody has yet questioned. Goddard's claim about these is unsettling and simple. He held that inner conversations are not idle. They are the actual assumption a person is making about their situation, delivered in the most convincing possible form, which is the form of ordinary self-talk that never announces itself as a belief. Applied to money, the pattern is specific enough to catch. Listen for the imaginary conversations in which you are explaining a shortage, explaining to a partner why something has to wait, explaining to yourself why a particular option is not available, rehearsing how you would describe your position if somebody asked. Every one of these requires, as its premise, the very condition a person says they want changed, and every one of them is conducted with complete sincerity, which in Goddard's system is the only ingredient that matters. His correction is not to suppress the talk, which cannot be done, but to change who the conversation is with and what it is about. He asked people to conduct inner conversations that could only take place from the state of the wish fulfilled, not conversations about getting there. Conversations that presuppose arrival and are about something else entirely, in the way that real conversations after a resolved difficulty are usually about something else, because the difficulty has stopped being a topic. This is the part of the method most likely to be quietly skipped, because it does not feel like a technique. There is no session, no closing of the eyes, no set time. It is a correction applied dozens of times a day, in traffic and in queues, and in the 2 minutes before sleep, and it consists mostly of noticing that a rehearsal has started and declining to finish it. The connection to the surrender of the means is exact and worth stating. An inner conversation about how something might work out is a design meeting for a route. Held often enough, it becomes the dominant assumption of the day, regardless of what was done deliberately the night before. Goddard's position was that the deliberate session establishes the state, and the inner conversations either carry it or dismantle it, and that most people lose the whole of the ground they gained in the 10 minutes during the following hour on the way to work, talking silently to somebody who is not there about a problem they have asked to be relieved of. Prayer as Goddard actually defined it. In 1945, Goddard published a short book with a title that sends most modern readers in the wrong direction. Prayer, the Art of Believing. It is one of the least read of the 12, and for a video with this title, it is one of the most important, because it is the place where he dealt directly with the word that the sentence in the title depends on. His definition of prayer bears no resemblance to petition. Prayer, in his account, is not asking. It is not the presentation of a request to an authority who may or may not grant it. It is not persuasion, and it is not the accumulation of merit through repetition or sincerity. He defined it as the act of assuming the feeling of the wish already fulfilled, and he treated the word prayer as a technical term for that act rather than as a description of an appeal. Note the consequence, because it goes to the heart of this video's subject. A petition presupposes distance. It presupposes a gap between the one asking and the one able to grant, and it presupposes that the outcome depends on a decision being made elsewhere. Goddard's definition removes all three. There is no distance, because the faculty being addressed is the person's own imagination. There is no decision being made elsewhere, and the act is not a request but an occupation. This is why the sentence in the title is so easy to misread. Heard through the petition model, it means place your request and wait politely for an answer. Heard through Goddard's model, it means something almost opposite. It means stop asking, because asking is the assertion that you do not have it, and the assertion that you do not have it is the entire obstacle. The book is also where he was clearest that belief is not the same as intellectual agreement. A person can be entirely persuaded that a teaching is correct and still not believe in the sense he meant, because in his usage, belief is the acceptance of a state as one's present fact, not the endorsement of a proposition. This is the distinction that explains why so many people can describe this teaching accurately and get nothing from it. They have agreed with it. They have not assumed anything. For the purposes of this video, the section can be reduced to a single point. If prayer means asking, the title's instruction is passive, and the whole thing collapses into waiting. If prayer means the assumption of the fulfilled state, as Goddard defined it in 1945, and never revised, then the instruction is active, specific, and demanding, and it asks a person to give up the one thing that feels most like effort, which is the asking itself. The interval nobody warns you about. There is a gap between the assumption and its visible result, and Goddard was less romantic about it than most of his modern interpreters are. It is worth spending a section on the gap itself because it is where nearly everybody stops. He named the principle in the title of a book, Seed Time and Harvest, in 1956. The image is agricultural for a reason. A seed goes into the ground and disappears. For a period afterwards there is no visible difference between ground that has been sown and ground that has not. The seed is not visibly doing anything, and the person who planted it has no way of inspecting progress without digging it up, which destroys it. That last detail is the whole teaching in one image. Inspection is not neutral. It is the specific act that undoes the process. And it is also the act a person most wants to perform during exactly the period when nothing appears to be happening. The interval has a particular emotional texture that is worth naming in advance, because naming it makes it survivable. It begins with a period of quiet confidence, immediately after the assumption has been established, when the state feels natural and the matter genuinely seems settled. That period does not last. It is followed by a stretch, usually longer, in which nothing has visibly changed. The original circumstance is still present and still making its case daily, and the assumption starts to feel like a thing a person is maintaining rather than a thing that is simply true. This is the point at which most people conclude the method has failed. Goddard's account is that the interval is not evidence of anything, not evidence that it is working, not evidence that it is not. It is simply the period during which the outer world has not yet caught up with a change that has already been made, and its duration is not something a person can influence by attention, worry, or effort. He was consistent that the only fatal move during the interval is the abandonment of the state, because abandoning it stops the process rather than pausing it. What he offered instead of reassurance was a redefinition of the task during the interval. The task is not to endure, it is to keep occupying, which is a different and lighter thing. Endurance implies strain against a contrary fact. Occupation implies simply being where you decided to be, and returning there when you notice you have wandered, without treating the wandering as a failure or the return as an achievement. The instruction that comes out of this is the least dramatic in the video, and possibly the most useful. During the interval, do nothing about the interval. Live the days. Do the work in front of you. Return to the state at night. And do not dig up the ground to see whether anything is happening down there, because in Goddard's account, the digging is the only thing that can genuinely stop it. The Law and the Promise, and its collected testimonies. In 1961, near the end of his most active period, Goddard published a book that is unlike the others in construction. The Law and the Promise is built substantially around accounts he had received from people who had applied the method, and it is worth a section because of what its structure implies about the man who assembled it. The title names the two halves of his teaching, and the division is important. The law is the mechanism this whole video has been describing, the operation of assumption on circumstance, available to anybody regardless of what they believe about anything else. The promise is the other thing, the mystical experience he described in his later years, and which he held to be the actual purpose of the whole system, with the law functioning as a kind of proof of concept along the way. He never claimed the two were the same, and he was clear that a person could use the law effectively for years without any interest in the promise at all. What matters here is the shape of the accounts. Read as a group, they are not stories of dramatic intervention. They are overwhelmingly stories of ordinary sequences that ended somewhere the person had assumed and could not have arranged. Somebody who is offered something by a person who had no idea it was wanted. Somebody whose circumstances change through a chain of events that begins with an entirely unrelated inconvenience. The material is far more mundane than the modern retelling of this teaching would suggest, and the mundanity is the useful part. There is an honest limitation to state, and this channel would rather state it than let the book do more work than it can bear. These accounts are unverified reports from correspondence, collected by an interested party, with no independent corroboration, no record of the accounts that did not work, and no way to assess how many people applied the method and wrote nothing. That is not a scandal, and it does not make the book worthless, but it does mean the accounts function as illustrations of a claimed pattern rather than as evidence for it. What can fairly be taken from the collection is the pattern rather than the proof. Across a large number of unrelated accounts from unrelated people, the reported route is almost never the route the person had in mind, and the eventual arrival is almost always described in retrospect as a chain of small events rather than a single decisive one. If nothing else, this is a consistent report about where people find the thing when they stop looking for it in the place they expected. The difference between rest and doing nothing. An objection has been building through this whole video, and it deserves a section of its own rather than a defensive paragraph. If the means are not a person's responsibility, why would they do anything at all? Goddard's answer is more precise than the popular versions of it. He did not teach inactivity. He taught that action which proceeds from an assumption already made is entirely different in character from action undertaken in order to make something happen, and that the first kind is not only permitted but inevitable. Consider the distinction concretely. Two people send the same message to the same person on the same afternoon. One sends it from a state of quiet settledness, because it is the obvious next thing to do and nothing much depends on the reply. The other sends it as a bid, having calculated it as the most promising available route, and then spends the rest of the day monitoring for a response and interpreting the silence. The outer act is identical. In Goddard's system, the two acts are not the same act at all, because the state producing them is different, and the state is the causative thing. So the instruction is not to stop acting. It is to stop acting from the assumption of absence. This turns out to be a workable practical test, and it can be applied to any specific decision in about 15 seconds. Ask what the state is that this action is coming out of. If the answer is that it comes from settledness and it is simply the next reasonable thing, do it without further examination. If the answer is that it comes from urgency and it is being performed to force a result, Goddard's position is that the action will carry the urgency into the world, and the world will report the urgency back. There is a second half to this, and it is the part that prevents the teaching from becoming an excuse. A person genuinely occupying the state of the wish fulfilled does not become passive. They become ordinary. They answer the letters, do the work, keep the commitments, and take the opportunities that appear, and they do all of it without the constant background calculation about what any of it might lead to. What actually disappears is not activity, but strain, and the disappearance of strain is frequently mistaken by the person themselves for laziness, because they have never before done anything competent without anxiety attached. Goddard's own phrase for the correct posture is the one this video has already given. Totally indifferent as to possible failure. That is not indifference to the outcome. It is indifference to the question of whether it will occur, held by somebody who is otherwise fully engaged with their own life. The distinction is thin on paper and completely obvious in practice, because the two states feel nothing alike from the inside. It is worth adding that Goddard offered no support at all for the opposite error, which is the decision to withdraw from ordinary responsibility on the grounds that the matter has been handed over. Nothing in his book suggests that obligations stop applying to a person who has assumed correctly, and his own life is the plainest available argument against that reading, since he kept a public lecture schedule for more than 20 years while teaching this material. The surrender he described is a surrender of the design of the means, and it is a surrender made in the imagination rather than in the diary. What Goddard never promised about money. A video with this title owes its audience a list of the things the teaching does not claim. stated as plainly as the things it does. Overselling is the standard failure of this entire field, and it is worth being exact. Goddard never promised a timescale. Nowhere in the 12 books or the recorded lecture years is there a commitment to a period within which an assumption becomes visible. The documented cases attributed to him range from a matter of days to considerably longer, and he never presented the fast ones as the standard or offered any rule about how long an interval should run. Anyone quoting him as a source for a 21-day rule or a manifestation window is quoting somebody else. He never promised amounts. He described transformations of circumstance, not sums. The specific figures that circulate in his name are not his, and the canonical record deliberately avoids attaching numbers to his own accounts because the accounts do not contain them. He never promised that the method removes the need to live an ordinary life. He worked. He lectured for over 2 decades, which is a working schedule by any measure. He did not describe a state in which obligations dissolve, and he did not teach that a person who has assumed correctly stops having to do anything. He never promised that the outcome would look like the thing that was imagined. His whole doctrine of the means points the other way, and the collected accounts almost uniformly report arrival by an unanticipated route. A person who imagines the end and then requires the route to be recognizable has quietly reintroduced the very specification the method asks them to drop. He never claimed scientific support and never appealed to physics. That connection was manufactured decades later by people writing in a different idiom. And he never promised that it always works, in the sense of offering a guarantee. What he claimed was that a law operates, and that failure to obtain a result indicates the condition was not met, which is a claim with an obvious weakness that the next section addresses directly rather than avoiding. There is one more absence worth naming. He did not treat money as a special category requiring special technique. In his system, money is simply one more outer fact, no different in kind from health or a location or a relationship, and no different in mechanism. The reason a video like this one exists is that money is where most people feel the pressure most sharply, not because Goddard had a money method separate from the rest of the teaching. Stating all of this costs nothing and buys something specific. It means that whatever remains after the removals is the actual teaching rather than the marketing of it, and the actual teaching is narrow enough to be attempted honestly. Objections worth taking seriously. Any teaching of this kind attracts easy objections and one serious one, and the serious one should be met head-on. The serious objection is that the system cannot fail in any way that would count as evidence against it. If a person assumes and obtains the result, that confirms the law. If a person assumes and does not obtain it, the explanation is that the assumption was not truly made, or was not persisted in, or was contradicted during the day. There is no observable outcome that the framework cannot absorb. That is a real structural problem, and no honest treatment should pretend otherwise. Goddard's own answer, insofar as he gave one, was that the interior state is directly available to the person themselves, and therefore checkable by them, even though it is invisible to everybody else. A person can tell whether they are anxious about a matter. The indifference he described is not a subtle thing requiring instruments. It is either present or it is conspicuously absent, and he treated its absence as diagnostic rather than as an excuse. That is a reasonable answer as far as it goes, and it does not fully dispose of the objection. What can be said fairly is this: the teaching is not testable in the way a claim about the outer world is testable, and anybody presenting it as scientifically established is misrepresenting it. What it is a description of an interior discipline whose results the person practicing it can assess for themselves, with all the limitations that implies about self-report. The second objection is more practical and comes up constantly. If this works, why is the world not full of people who have used it? The honest answer is that the discipline is small but relentless, and relentless small disciplines have very poor completion rates in any field. The method asks for a nightly practice of 10 minutes and a running correction of thought during the day, sustained across an interval of unknown length, with no feedback. Almost nothing that requires those conditions is widely completed, and this would be true whether or not the underlying claim is correct. The third objection deserves a direct answer because it is the one that matters most to a person in genuine difficulty. Does this teaching blame people for their own circumstances? Goddard's framework does place the cause of circumstance in consciousness, and a careless reading of that produces exactly the blame the objection fears. What his own emphasis suggests is different. He was almost entirely uninterested in how a state came to be occupied and almost entirely focused on what could be occupied next. There is no archaeology in his method. He never asked anybody to find out what they had done to deserve a situation. He asked what state they intended to occupy tonight, which is a forward-looking question, with no accusation in it. A fourth objection is raised less often and is more interesting than the other three. If a person's assumption produces their circumstances, what happens to everybody else, who presumably have assumptions of their own? Goddard's answer was that other people appear in a person's experience according to the state that person occupies, which sounds evasive until it is tested against ordinary experience, where it is unremarkably true that the same colleague is experienced very differently by two people in the same office. What he did not claim, and what should not be claimed on his behalf, is any power over another person's own life as they live it. His teaching concerns the state a person occupies and what that state reports back, and it says nothing at all about arranging anybody else. When nothing appears to be happening yet, this section is for the specific evening when the practice has been kept for weeks, and the outer facts are exactly where they were. It is the most common place for a person to abandon the method, and it deserves direct address rather than encouragement. The first thing to establish is what the absence of change actually indicates in Goddard's system, and the answer is nothing whatsoever, because the outer world is held to report a condition rather than generate one, and because the report is understood to lag, an unchanged circumstance at any given moment carries no information about whether the underlying state has changed. It is the equivalent of checking a photograph for signs of an event that occurred after the shutter closed. The second thing is more useful. There is one thing available to inspect that is not the outer world, and it is the only inspection Goddard would have sanctioned. Ask what happens now when the subject comes up. Not what the circumstances are, but what the interior response is when the matter is mentioned, when a bill arrives, when somebody asks. If the response is the same tightening it was 3 weeks ago, then the state has not in fact changed, and the practice has been a nightly performance rather than an assumption. If the response has quietly become flatter, less interesting, less urgent, something has moved, regardless of what the numbers say. That flattening is the actual milestone in this teaching, and it is almost never described as one, because it does not feel like progress. It feels like the problem has become boring. In Goddard's account, boring is precisely correct. A settled matter is boring. Nobody experiences a rush of feeling about something they have already got, and the arrival of ordinariness where there used to be anxiety is the closest thing to a reliable indicator the method offers. The third thing is a caution against a specific mistake made at exactly this point. The temptation, when nothing appears to be happening, is to intensify, to imagine harder, longer, with more detail, and more force. Goddard's position was that intensity is not the operative variable, and that effort of that kind is itself a signal of disbelief, because a person does not strain to accept something they already regard as true. If the practice has become effortful, the correction is to make it smaller and calmer, not larger. And the fourth thing is permission, which this material rarely grants. It is allowed to be difficult. Nothing in Goddard's teaching requires a person to feel serene about a hard situation, and the assumption he described is not the same as cheerfulness. A person can be tired, worried, and entirely out of patience, and still, for 10 minutes before sleep, occupy a state in which the matter is done. He never asked for more than that. A night practice described without ceremony. Everything in this video converges on a practice that takes about 10 minutes and requires nothing. Goddard called the condition it uses the state akin to sleep, and it is worth describing plainly, without atmosphere. The state he meant is the drowsy border condition that occurs naturally every night, between full wakefulness and sleep. Not a trance, not a meditative attainment, and nothing requiring instruction. It is the condition a person is already in for a few minutes each night, and normally passes through without using. His claim was that in this condition, the ordinary critical activity of the mind is quiet, and that an assumption made there meets less contradiction than the same assumption made at noon. The practice itself has 3 parts and no more. First, construct a short scene which would only be occurring if the thing were already true. Short is important. Goddard was consistent that a brief, ordinary scene is more effective than an elaborate one, and the test of the scene is not whether it is impressive, but whether it implies the fulfillment. For a financial matter, the scene is almost never money. It is the far more ordinary moment that only exists on the other side of it. Somebody saying something that would only be said, a room that would only look like that, an unremarkable action that would only be taking place. Second, enter the scene rather than watch it. This is the distinction he made most often, and the one most frequently missed. A person watching themselves from outside is observing a situation they do not occupy, which is the assumption of separateness. The instruction is to be inside, looking out through your own eyes, with the physical detail that entails, so that the scene has the texture of experience rather than the texture of a picture. Third, hold it in the drowsy state and let it repeat gently until sleep comes. Not with force, not with counting, not with a set number of repetitions. Goddard described this as the natural way a person falls asleep inside any preoccupying thought, which everybody has done accidentally after a good day or a bad one, and he asked only that the thought be chosen deliberately rather than inherited from the day. That is the entire technique. There is no preparation, no posture, no requirement about time of night, and nothing that has to be purchased or learned. What makes it difficult is not the practice, but the 15 hours around it, which is why the mental diet and the discipline of inner conversation take up more of this video than the technique does. What to carry into sleep tonight? If nothing else from the last 90 minutes is retained, this is the part designed to be carried into the dark. The first thing to carry is the division of labor, because everything else follows from it. There is one job that belongs to you, and it is to occupy the finished state. There is a second job, which is the arrangement of every root and circumstance and coincidence that produces the visible fact, and Goddard's entire teaching is the claim that this second job is handled by a faculty you already possess, and which does not require or benefit from your supervision. The second thing to carry is the correct name for the faculty, not an external provider. Your own imagination, which Goddard identified as the creative power itself and called God without apology in the lectures of his last decade. This keeps the surrender honest. Nothing is being handed to a stranger. Responsibility is moving from the calculating part of you to the creative part of you, and both of them are yours. The third thing to carry is the diagnostic, which is the most useful single item in the video. Indifference as to possible failure, not confidence, not enthusiasm, and not a feeling of certainty that has to be produced and maintained. Simply the absence of the question. If the question of whether it will happen has stopped presenting itself, the state is held. If it presents itself hourly, the state is not held yet, and the correction is a return rather than an effort. The fourth thing to carry is the permission to stop searching. Understood correctly. This is not permission to neglect anything. Do the work. Pay what is owed. Take what is offered. What is being set down is the inner surveillance that runs underneath all of that, the constant scanning for evidence, the rehearsal of routes, the checking. That is the activity Goddard identified as the assumption of absence performed dozens of times a day by somebody who believes they are being responsible. And the last thing to carry is the scene. One short, ordinary, unimpressive scene that would only be taking place if the matter were already settled. Not the money. The Tuesday afterwards. Find it before you turn the light off. Enter it from the inside and let it be the last thing running as the drowsiness takes over. That is all that is being asked tonight. Not belief in a system, not certainty. One scene, entered from the inside, and the deliberate laying down of the search until morning. A closing word on rest and duty. The word duty is doing something specific in the title of this video, and it is worth ending on it. A duty is not a hope, and it is not a favor. It is an obligation that belongs to whoever holds it, and it is discharged whether or not the person owed it is watching. When the title says, "The money is God's duty now," it is making a claim about ownership of a task, and this video has spent 90 minutes establishing that the claim is a fair, if loose translation of something Goddard actually taught, provided the word God is read as he read it. The precise version of the claim is his own sentence from 1944, and it is the one worth remembering rather than the title. Acceptance of the end wills the means to that end. The end is yours to accept. The means are willed by the acceptance itself and require nothing further from you. That is not a promise about the universe being kind. It is a description of a mechanism, stated by a man who had spent a decade testing it privately before he ever said it aloud to anybody. What the teaching actually asks for is smaller than most people expect, and harder than it sounds. 10 minutes of deliberate occupation at the edge of sleep, a running refusal, through the day, of the sentences that assert the opposite, and the setting down of the search, which is the only part that feels like a loss, because searching is the last activity that still feels like doing something about it. Goddard did not offer certainty about timing, and this video will not manufacture any. What he offered was a redistribution of effort. All the energy that goes into calculating routes, monitoring for evidence, and rehearsing explanations is, in his account, energy spent maintaining the very condition a person wants to leave. Withdrawn from that and placed instead on a single settled state held nightly, the same energy does something else entirely. So the last instruction is the one the title gives, now that it can be read accurately. Stop looking. Not because looking is forbidden, and not because a distant authority has taken the file. Stop looking, because in Goddard's account, the looking is the delay, the search is the assumption of absence, and the thing being searched for is produced by a state that no search has ever been able to occupy. Set it down tonight. It will still be there in the morning if you want to pick it up again. Goddard's argument, made consistently for 30 years, is that you will find you do not.